In the history of mankind, there are empires whose traces even pitiless time cannot erase. They leave behind not only ruined aqueducts, sand-swept amphitheaters, and roads as straight as arrows. They leave behind the very idea of absolute order. And no empire of antiquity shone as brightly or as terrifyingly as Rome. Imagine the world of the 1st century AD. From the scorching, sun-baked deserts of North Africa to the dense, damp, and dark forests of Germania. All of this was the domain of a single giant state. The Mediterranean Sea, the cradle of civilizations, had become the calm inland lake of the empire. Across these boundless lands reigned the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, an era of stability and prosperity. But do not be deceived. This peace was not forged by the subtle diplomacy of philosophers or the beautiful speeches of senators in snow-white togas. It was forged with iron, blood, sweat, and unprecedented brutal discipline. Behind every tax collector, every merchant, and every builder of aqueducts stood a relentless military machine. The foundation of this colossal power was the legions, not just an army in the modern sense, but a living, breathing, lethal organism. Every soldier was a hardened cog, every unit a steel lever. To be a legionary meant giving one's life to Rome for 25 long years. These were men whose hands had grown calloused from the constant construction of marching camps, whose shoulders were accustomed to the weight of 20 kilograms of gear, and whose feet, clad in hobnailed Caligay sandals, had ground the roads of half the world into dust. And among the dozens of legions guarding the stretched borders of civilization, there were those whose names were spoken with a special reverence, the elite of the elite, those who were sent where others retreated. One of them was the 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Spanish. Their history was not written on clean parchment. It was carved by gladi on the fields of antiquity's greatest battles. This legion remembered Gaius Julius Caesar himself. It was the 9th that followed him into Gaul, step by step breaking the fierce resistance of the Celtic tribes. They stood to the death in the fratricidal civil wars that decided the fate of Rome itself. Later, they spilled their own blood and the blood of others in sweltering Iberia, fighting the rebellious Cantabri among the dusty mountains, for which they earned their honorary moniker, Spanish. By the beginning of the 2nd century AD, these were no green youths seeking easy glory or clinking coin. These were seasoned veterans, men with weather-beaten faces and scars, for whom war had long become the only trade they understood. 5,000 professionals. When the brass cornicen sounded and they formed their battle lines, locking together their heavy, curved scutum shields, they transformed into a solid wall bristling with spears, a wall against which any barbarian army shattered into bloody spray, and above their heads, catching the dull rays of the sun, proudly rose the golden eagle, the aquila, the sacred symbol of the legion, the embodiment of honor, immortality, and the god Jupiter himself. To lose the eagle meant eternal disgrace. To protect it required the last drop of blood. But the empire always demanded more. It was hungry for new lands. In the 43rd year AD, by order of Emperor Claudius, an armada of Roman ships crossed the stormy waters of the English Channel. Their target was Britannia. For a resident of sunny Rome or Naples, this was the literal edge of the world, a land whispered about in the forums only in dark legends. They said the sun never shone there for weeks, that the sky wept eternal cold rain, and that within the dense, impenetrable oak forests lived druids, priests in white robes, offering horrific blood sacrifices to their dark gods. Britannia was a place where logic ended and primal chaos began. The Ninth Spanish was at the vanguard of this massive invasion in the 43rd year. They marched through the southern and central lands of the island, leaving behind straight roads, stone forts, and the ashes of defiant villages. But the conquest of this wild land dragged on for long decades, and the island repeatedly bared its teeth to the Romans. The most terrifying trial for the Ninth Legion came in the 61st year, when the Britannic queen Boudica launched a colossal rebellion. Then, the island nearly threw off the Roman yoke. The Ninth Legion, attempting to ride to the rescue of besieged colonies, fell into a monstrous ambush. On that black day, the Legion lost almost all of its infantry. Thousands of soldiers were left lying in the British mud, hacked down by Celtic swords. The Legion survived by a miracle. Only the cavalry units escaped. It was rebuilt, replenished with fresh recruits from the Germanic provinces. And now, half a century later, standing on the threshold of new battles, the Legion still remembered that horror. The memory of Boudica's rebellion was burned into the very soul of the Ninth. They knew, this land forgives no mistakes, and it always thirsts for Roman blood. Years later, they founded the mighty fortress of Eboracum, the very one the English would centuries later call York. Eboracum became their home, their stronghold, and the main bastion of civilization in the wild north. Around it stood bathhouses, temples, and merchant stalls. Life boiled over. Behind the high wooden palisades, which were later replaced by stone walls, the legionaries cleaned their armor, rolled dice, and wrote letters home. It seemed Rome had entrenched itself here forever. Nothing on earth could move these men of iron from their positions. Decades passed. The year 117 AD arrived. In Rome itself, Emperor Trajan was dying, and Hadrian prepared to ascend the throne. But here, on the edge of the world, the politics of the Senate seemed infinitely distant. Rome's grip on Britannia still remained as fragile as the first morning ice. The further north the legions tried to push, the fiercer and more merciless the resistance became. There, beyond the line of familiar forests, in the cold fogs of Caledonia, the rocky lands of modern-day Scotland, lived tribes that had never known defeat. The Romans called them Picts, the painted ones. They covered their bodies with blue woad dye, painting terrifying patterns. Fierce as forest phantoms, they did not engage in fair, open-field battles. They struck lightning-fast blows from ambushes, slaughtered patrols, and vanished without a trace into the thickets, leaving behind only the mutilated bodies of legionaries. And now, the northern borders were ablaze once more. A massive uprising had flared up. The garrisons of border forts went silent, one by one. The smoke from burning watchtowers choked the horizon. The situation was spiraling out of control. It was necessary to crush this rebellion once and for all, to tear it out by the roots, to show the savages the full weight of the empire's wrath. The order was given, and it was to be carried out by the most experienced, most formidable argument Rome had on this island. Early in the morning, the heavy wooden gates of the Eboracum fortress swung open with a roar. 5,000 soldiers of the Ninth Spanish Legion marched out of the camp. They moved in a steady, unwavering formation. The sodden British earth squelched beneath their hobnailed sandals. Their segmented armor gleamed dully under a leaden sky that threatened to pour rain. Supply wagons creaked. Horses snorted anxiously. At the head of the column, surrounded by an honor guard, the golden eagle swayed proudly on its staff. They were marching north into the gray, cold unknown, marching to pacify the defiant ghosts of Caledonia and once again prove the supremacy of Roman steel. They marched with confidence. They were the elite, but neither the centurions nor the ordinary legionaries yet knew that this march into the cold north wind would become their step into eternity, a step into the darkness from which they would never return. The first days of the march seemed deceptively calm. The 9th Legion moved along the famous Roman roads, straight, paved with heavy stone, cutting through the British landscapes like scars of civilization. The echo of 5,000 hobnailed sandals carried over the hills in a steady, hypnotic beat. This was the sound of Rome itself, the confident, unstoppable rhythm of a massive machine. But the further north the column went, leaving the safe walls of Iberacum behind, the more the world around them changed. The stone beneath their feet gradually gave way to gravel, and then surrendered completely to thick, squelching mud. Roman engineers, capable of piercing mountains and turning rivers, were powerless against the Caledonian swamps. The mighty stride of the legion slowed. Supply wagons, heavy scorpions, and ballistae sank to their axles. Horses slipped and snorted in terror, tearing at their hooves. Soldiers had to spend hours pushing the carts knee-deep in the icy muck. The sky changed, too. It seemed to lower, crushing the earth with a leaden weight. The sun, so familiar to the veterans of southern campaigns, became a rare visitor. In its place came the rain. Not a fierce, brief downpour, but a fine, bone-chilling, endless water dust. This cold mist crept under woolen cloaks and seeped beneath armor plates. The 20 kilograms of gear, which once felt like a customary burden, now dragged them to the ground like iron weights. Leather straps swelled with moisture and rubbed shoulders raw. The hilts of their swords grew slick. The nature of Caledonia did not engage them in open combat. It slowly, methodically drained their strength. But the hardest trial was the silence. The Roman army was accustomed to the noise of war, to the screams of barbarians beating weapons against shields, to the roar of war horns, to the clash of metal. Here, there was a dead, ringing silence, broken only by the howling of the wind through the dry heather. The legion was marching through enemy territory, but the enemy was nowhere to be seen. On the 5th day of the march, the vanguard was supposed to reach one of the distant watchforts, a small wooden stronghold held by an auxiliary cohort. There, the legionaries hoped to resupply with dry grain, warm themselves by large hearths, and gather intelligence on the movements of the rebel tribes. But when the lead units crested the hill, they were met only by a black, smoking wound on the body of the earth. The fort no longer existed. The high palisade had been reduced to charred ribs sticking out of the mud. The watchtowers had collapsed inward, burying the courtyard in ash. Centurions barked sharp orders, and the legion instantly shifted into battle formation. Shields locked, spears lowered. They waited for the attack. But no one charged at them from the forest. Scout detachments cautiously entered the smoldering ruins, and what they found there made even the most hardened veterans who had survived the slaughters in Iberia shudder. There were no bodies in the camp, not a single corpse of a Roman soldier, no signs of battle, no dropped weapons or shattered shields. The 300 men of the garrison had simply vanished. Only one message was left behind. In the very center of the burned parade ground, right where the altar to the emperor once stood, a tall, crooked stake was driven into the earth. Atop it rested the bloody helmet of the camp prefect, and around the stake, on the ash, laid out in massive, unnaturally perfect circles, were stones painted with blue dye, patterns of intertwined spirals and serpent heads, symbols that had nothing to do with human writing. It was the language of primal terror, the language of the Picts. They hadn't just destroyed the fort. They had performed a ritual. They showed that the masters here were not the Roman gods, but the ancient spirits of this land. From that moment on, the mood within the legion subtly shifted. Discipline remained ironclad. The soldiers still executed orders flawlessly, but anxiety settled in their eyes. As the column pushed deeper into the endless heather moors, squeezed between gloomy crags, the signs became more frequent. It was a game designed to drive them mad. In the mornings, sentries found strange amulets woven from crow feathers and human hair hanging from the trees along the trail. Fresh blue runes, drawn with woad dye, appeared on bare stones. And sometimes, in the gathering twilight, the legionaries felt that pale faces were silently watching them from behind the trunks of ancient oaks. The Picts never once engaged in battle, but they made it clear. Every step of the 9th Legion was known. Every halt to rest was in the crosshairs of unseen eyes. Soon, the terrain grew even harsher. The Legion drew into a narrow, deep gorge, at the bottom of which churned an icy river. The sheer cliffs on either side, overgrown with slippery black moss, pressed down with their sheer mass. Sunlight barely reached this place, and it was here, at the bottom of this stone sack, that their main enemy awaited. The fog began to roll down from the mountains. This was no ordinary morning mist. The fog was thick, dense, like living, breathing milk. It crawled slowly across the ground, swallowing the wagons, the horses, and then the men themselves. In barely half an hour, visibility dropped to just a few steps. The soldiers in the rear ranks could no longer see the golden eagle in the vanguard. The Legion, this perfect, coordinated machine of death, was blinded. The world narrowed to the back of the comrade marching just ahead. Sounds became distorted. Footsteps echoed with a muffled thud, as if coming from underwater. 5,000 men dissolved into the white veil. They had crossed the invisible border separating the empire of men from the realm of shadows. And from this fog, they were never destined to emerge into the light. The fog was not simply a whim of the weather. In Caledonia, it felt like a living, thinking entity, the most loyal ally of the defiant tribes. It filled their lungs, settled in cold drops on their eyelashes, and distorted everything beyond recognition. The 9th Legion, squeezed into the narrow stone gorge, was moving blind. Their greatest advantage, the impenetrable formation, had turned against them here. The legionaries lacked the space to square their shoulders. The massive scutum shields snagged on one another and scraped against the wet cliffs. The column stretched out for miles, transforming from a spear of steel into a blind, lumbering snake. The first blow was not struck by a sword. It was struck by fear. Somewhere at the very end of the column, in the rear guard, a scream rang out, a short, gurgling sound that was instantly cut off, drowning in the thick milk of the fog. The column halted. The order to close ranks was passed down the line. Centurions, with gladi drawn, rushed to the tail of the formation, expecting to see an enemy break through. But they found no one. Only thick mud, a crumpled red cloak, and a dropped shield, upon which a fresh bloodstain was slowly spreading, and no sign of the attackers. It was as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed the legionary. From that moment on, death became their constant, invisible companion. The Picts did not engage in fair combat. They attacked like a pack of starving wolves, tearing at a massive but clumsy beast. Out of the white veil, from somewhere above, from unseen rocky ledges, heavy stones and javelins rained down silently. They pierced armor, broke bones, and crushed helmets. The legionaries raised their shields, forming the famous testudo, or tortoise formation. But in the narrow gorge, this tactic was vulnerable. The Romans hurled their pila blindly into the fog, hearing in response only the dull thud of iron against stone. The enemy was everywhere, and nowhere. By day, they lost men by the dozens. Soldiers vanished from the flanks the moment they took a wrong step away from the main column. Pack horses slipped from the cliffs into the icy river, dragging wagons of precious provisions down with them. But the true nightmare was the knights. In this cursed gorge, it was impossible to build a proper Roman camp. There was no space for trenches or palisades. There was no dry wood to light fires and warm their freezing bodies. 5,000 men sat on wet stones, huddled together, never taking off their soaked armor. The darkness was absolute. That was when the psychological torture began. From the black void came sounds that made their blood run cold, whistles mimicking the cries of night birds, the low, vibrating drone of Celtic war horns, the carnesses, sounding like the death wails of giant monsters, and sometimes laughter, a quiet, mocking whisper drifting from all sides. The savages knew the names of the Roman centurions. Out of the dark, in broken Latin, they promised them a swift and agonizing death. The legion did not sleep. Men who had survived the hell of civil wars began to break. Some prayed to Jupiter, others gripped the hilts of their swords until their knuckles turned white, staring into the darkness until their eyes burned. Every rustle made them flinch. The iron discipline of Rome showed its first crack. One night, a young legionary, unable to bear the tension, screamed and charged into the darkness, hacking at the emptiness with his sword. He was never seen again. In the morning, his severed head was found resting on a stone in the very center of their own camp. Exhaustion, cold, and a constant, draining terror were doing their work. The legion's commander knew if they did not get out of this gorge and into an open space, they would all die here, without even seeing the faces of their killers. Time lost its meaning. After an eternity in this cursed stone sack, the fog finally began to thin. A clearing appeared ahead. The cliffs parted, revealing the way into a wide valley. The legionaries quickened their pace. Hope illuminated their exhausted faces. Just a little more, and they would be able to form a battle line, use their tactics, and fight like Romans. But they did not yet know that the exit from the gorge was not salvation. It was the open gates into a giant, meticulously planned trap. The vanguard stepped out of the gorge, and the legion finally exhaled. Before them lay a vast, bowl-shaped valley, ringed by dark, forested hills. The fog clung only to the ground, allowing the pale northern sun to glint off their armor. The centurion shouted orders, commanding the cohorts to spread out, to form the invincible Roman wall. But the relief was a fatal illusion. The moment the heavy infantry stepped off the rocky path and deployed into the field, the ground beneath their feet gave way. It was not a solid meadow. It was a massive, treacherous peat bog, carefully masked by a thick layer of tall heather and moss. The trap snapped shut. The weight of their own armor, the very thing that made them the masters of the world, became their doom. The legionaries sank to their knees, then to their waists in the freezing black sludge. The strict geometric lines of the Roman formation, practiced for centuries, crumbled in seconds. The cohorts mixed together. Panic, raw and contagious, ripped through the ranks. And then, the hills around them came alive. A deafening roar shattered the silence of Caledonia. It was a terrifying chorus of thousands of voices, the frantic beating of weapons against shields, and the piercing, demonic shriek of the Carnyx horns. From the tree line, pouring down the slopes like a blue tidal wave, came the Picts. There were no more ghosts, no more invisible archers. Now they showed their true face. They were wild, their skin covered entirely in woad dye, swirling in nightmarish patterns. Armed with long spears, heavy axes, and iron broadswords, they rushed not at a disciplined army, but at a terrified, paralyzed beast trapped in a mire. The slaughter began. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The legionaries fought with the desperation of doomed men, but they couldn't maneuver. Every swing of a gladius required immense effort just to keep from being sucked deeper into the swamp. Roman blood mixed with the black water of the bog. The cries of the dying were swallowed by the muddy earth. In the center of this chaotic hell, a final desperate stand took place. A circle of surviving veterans closed around the Aquilifer, the bearer of the golden eagle. Covered in mud and gore, they fought like demons, piling the bodies of their enemies in a ring around themselves. But the horde was endless. A brutal blow from a heavy axe shattered the staff. The golden eagle, the sacred soul of the 9th Legion, the symbol of Rome's eternal glory, spun through the air and plunged into the bloody muck. With the fall of the eagle, the spirit of the legion broke. And as the last defenders fell, something inexplicable happened. The fog, the thick, unnatural white milk that had tormented them in the gorge, rapidly rolled down from the hills, flooding the valley. It poured over the bodies, the weapons, and the blood, hiding the absolute carnage under a heavy, silent shroud. The clash of steel faded. The screams died away. The wind died down. By nightfall, there was nothing but absolute ringing silence. 5,000 elite soldiers of the Roman Empire had vanished. The earth and the fog had swallowed them whole, leaving not a single trace for history to find. News from the edge of the world reached Rome agonizingly slowly. At first, there were only fragmentary rumors. Merchants spoke of unsettling fires in the north of Britannia. Then, the couriers went silent. And then came the chilling realization. The 9th Spanish Legion, the pride of the empire, had ceased communication. 5,000 veterans had vanished without a trace into the fogs of Caledonia. For Rome, this was not just a military defeat. It was an existential shock. The invincible machine had malfunctioned. Barbarians, knowing neither tactics nor siege engines, had swallowed an entire legion along with its sacred eagle. The Senate was horrified. The empire, accustomed to expanding its borders, suddenly felt that something primal and ruthless was watching it from the dark. In the year 122 AD, the new Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britannia in person. He did not lead punitive expeditions to the north. A brilliant strategist, he looked at the leaden Caledonian hills and realized a terrifying truth. This darkness could not be conquered by the sword. It could only be locked away. And Hadrian gave an unprecedented order: to build a wall. From the Irish Sea to the North Sea, across the entire island, stretched a colossal barrier of stone, Hadrian's Wall. 80 Roman miles of stone, deep ditches, and impregnable watchtowers. This was not merely a state border. It was a monumental shield, designed to fence off the civilized world from the chthonic horror of the north. The Romans literally locked the door, leaving the ghosts of Caledonia on the other side. But what truly happened to the Ninth Legion? Historians argue about this to this day. The official Roman archives maintain a frightening silence. After the year 117, mentions of the Ninth Spanish are simply erased from all military records. It is as if the empire blotted them out of its memory. Some scholars believe that the legion suffered catastrophic losses in that rebellion and was disbanded in disgrace. Others believe that the remnants of the Ninth were later transferred east to Judea, where they perished in the flames of another uprising. But for those who stood the night watch on the cold walls of Hadrian's Wall, the answer was obvious. Peering into the thick northern fog, they gripped their spears tighter. They knew that there, in the impassable bogs and dark forests, their brothers in arms remained forever. Today, only ruins remain of mighty Rome. Hadrian's Wall is overgrown with grass and has become a picturesque route for travelers. But when a thick, heavy fog descends upon the moors of Scotland, and an icy wind begins to howl among the ancient stones, locals say that in the silence, you can still hear a muffled, rhythmic march and the clinking of armor. It is the Ninth Legion, lost in the centuries, still continuing its eternal march through the darkness.